The Surrealist style can be described as a mixture of poetry and dreams. According to Andre Breton, the author of the first Surrealist manifesto, it is the absence of all control by the reason. It is a movement that relied heavily on the instinct of the subconscious. The subconscious is made up of a person's inner thoughts and feelings, whether or not they are aware of them. Even though the movement started at the end of World War I, it is still relevant to today, and its influence has expanded into and can be seen in the fields of not only painting, but also sculpture, photography, drawings, film, architecture, and fashion.
Dadaism was classified as a reckless movement in response to rampant emotions from World War I. Later on, Breton would come to focus this movement into Surrealism, but Dadaism would be hectic for a little while longer. The center of Dadaism was in Zurich and was also the center of the war. So when these like-minded people came together, the movement broke out. The most famous artists of the time would be Marcel Duchamp, Johannes Bader, and John Hartfield, but there were quite a few involved in this movement. Marcel, aside from coming up with the ready-made, came up with the concept of retinal art, which was art simply able to be taken in at a glance. He also defied that art had to be beautiful, which carried over to the Surrealist movement. The art that came from Dadaism was shocking as far as color choice, font, and content choice. But in response to death and destruction on such a massive scale, who could blame him? However, in the midst of this chaos, the Dadaists introduced new media, which included newspapers, light bulbs, and other various objects. These artists paved the way for conceptual art, which was for the mind and a bit odd. As the parent of Surrealism, Dadaism also shared common themes with its branch off. Dadaism was a literary, intellectual, and artistic movement, and it was an attack on society. But of course, when Surrealism was funneled out of this movement, Dadaism faded off due to its chaos, but had its ideology and meaning carried through to Surrealism.
Okay, now moving on to the emergence of Surrealism, so how Surrealism came about. The first thing that we're going to talk about is society and the traditional ways of doing things. So Surrealism kind of came as a revolt against this traditional view, which was that everything had to be based off of logic and reasoning. They attacked traditional poetry, which they questioned, why does it have to be like this? Why can't it be anything else? Why is there set rules and guidelines? Why do we have to follow them? They wanted to separate also from morality, family, religion, kind of the things that are structured and have set rules. They kind of wanted to break away from that and do their own thing. Another thing that Surrealism kind of merged from was World War II and the response to that. So, World War II caused low morale, and it was unjust and unfair, and people were sick of the deaths and just the horrible news and the way that society, the economy, and everything was. So Surrealism kind of emerged from this as well as a kind of revolt against what society and government was doing at the time. Now getting into the actual emergence of Surrealism as how it emerged as a movement, not where it emerged from. Surrealism started with automatism, which was a spontaneous way of doing things. So with the picture on the slide to the right, you can see that there's a drawing with random lines, kind of crazy, no structure to it, obviously not a set thought or way of doing things. So a lot of times what early surrealists did is they would do hypnosis, take drugs, or kind of go into a sleep state where their unconscious mind was dominant, their subconscious, and they weren't conscious and actually thinking about what they were doing. It was more spontaneous. And so when painting came around with surrealists and the actual art, poets were kind of reluctant to merge painting in with surrealism because painting does take a long time, so it's not as spontaneous as the automatistic way.
Focusing on artists in this movement, I'd like to talk about Joan Miró. He was born in Barcelona and started drawing lessons at 7. Growing up in fine arts academies, this paved the way to Miró's career as a painter. Miró was originally a cubist, which centered on very strict lines, and to him became very constricting, and as history shows, Miró soon became a surrealist. He too was influenced by Freud's ideas of the mind and dreams, and he seemed to paint tormented monsters. Miró liked to paint the idea of something as opposed to an actual specific thing. He also refused to have a game plan, and he would just paint. Through this, he became a major player in the Surrealist movement. One of Miró's most famous pieces of work was one by the name of Snail Woman Flower Star. It's an odd name, and if you look at the piece, it gets even weirder. How does a snail woman flower star have anything to do with it? The more you look at the picture, you're like, wow, what's even happening? There's some words in the background in, a language we don't understand. There's what seems to be a face or a body or something, and coming down, is that a foot? Is that a hand? Is that some other body part? Whatever, this is Miró, and he took a different approach than, who we all think is the definition of surrealism. Davie took his approach. See, because how Miró approaches faces or bodies or anything else, it's a lot more abstract, and it's a lot more crazy looking. See, like, Davie, obviously, he's focusing on the idea of dreams as well, but Miró doesn't keep it as realistic looking. Davie had the clock thing, and the clock, you can tell it's a clock. You can tell it's a clock, and it looks, really real, and the shading's all really great, and then you look at Miró, and it's sort of like, oh, well, this is a little more odd. Okay. You can tell that he definitely has his emotions very involved in it by color choices and the way he decided to shape out these people, or where he even put their faces on the form. And I believe that's what set him apart from many of the other artists in the Surrealist movement and really put his name on the map and helped to influence many of the other artists in this movement.
Salvador Dali was a very key artist in the Surrealist movement. He had a very interesting and complex life. He was born 9 months after a brother of the same name who had died previously, and therefore was raised as his late brother by his parents, leading him to believe that he was his brother's reincarnation. Pain and pleasure for Dali were intimately intertwined. He would sometimes throw himself down the stairs for fun, for example. During his creative process, Dali would often stand on his head to induce hallucinations, and called this his paranoid critical method, which he said led to new perspectives. André Breton said that paranoia made us see the world as unstable, meaning that using this method, Dali transformed the world around him into a state that was as unstable as dreams are. Salvador Dali had a couple motifs that came up very often in his work. Among these were fried eggs, ants, cherries, phallic imagery, teeth, crutches, melons, instruments of mutilation, food, and double imagery. As a young man, Davie witnessed a horde of ants devour the corpse of a wounded bat. Bats, for him, represent flesh, and ants commonly represent death. Initially, early on in his life, Davie had wanted to become a cook, and often food in his art represents this childhood desire to become a chef. Davie claimed to remember intrauterine images. He described them as paradise, the color of hell, soft and warm with an immobile quality. Often, when fried eggs are used, it is in relation to those intrauterine images that he remembered before his birth. As a young man, Davie fantasized about a woman that he liked. And he remembers he used crutches and melons to fantasize about her. Often, any type of crutches or melons in his pieces indicate sexual fantasies. Salvador Dali had a desire to be unique, and often this came out violently. He had once pushed his friend off of a bridge and onto the rocks below, and the cherries that he ate by his friend's bed as his friend's mother tended to him, and the connection he saw between the cherries and all of the blood, often comes up in his works as cherries equal blood equal pain. Salvador Dali was obsessed with castration, putrefaction, voyeurism, onanism, coprophilia, and impotence. He was really kinky. And so when instruments of mutilation come up in his works, it is a nod to his sadomasochistic nature. Dali was very good friends with Sigmund Freud, and Freud was not only a huge influence in Dali's career, but also in the entire Surrealist movement as a whole. His ideas of penis envy and sensuality were very well received by the community and were taken by those artists. Dali especially put phallic imagery and bodies into his art. In this painting, we can see not only a half-naked body, but phallic imagery and crutches, which represent, as mentioned earlier, sexual fantasies. Now, Freud was also famous for his exploration of how dreams very often mirror a person's subconscious. For example, teeth were very often were a very key symbol for Freud, and he had said that a dream about one's teeth falling out meant anxiety about sexual repression and the desire to be nurtured as well. It would also point to a moment of transition, for example. Now, Dali played with this idea of the teeth and Freud and dreams in the subconscious, and did so in many mediums. He did not only use paint, but also use photography and a more 3D aspect of sculpture. He made this brooch that has the teeth made of pearls. And the interesting thing about the fact that he did use pearls in relation to something like teeth that implies so much decay, a break, a wearing away, when the pearls and the gemstones and the metals that he used are so permanent, is actually very interesting. Davie had once said, "A true painter is one who can paint extraordinary scenes in the middle of an empty desert. A true painter is one who can paint a pair in the middle of the tumult of history." Davie was quite fond of the desert background and used it often in his works. This can be seen in many of his works, including The Rose, which features a rose hovering in the middle of an empty sky with an empty desert background underneath it. Davie seemed to follow the spontaneity embraced by early literary surrealists. He had said, "I am often the first to be surprised and often terrified by the images I see appear upon my canvas. I register, without choice and with all possible exactitude, the dictate of my subconscious, my dreams." While the idea or the image that he would be painting might be spontaneous, the actual painting took a lot of time, and this can be seen in his painting style. He does not have a fuzzy style. It is very, very vivid, very clear, and all the while it has a certain dreamlike quality to it.
Okay, we're going to talk about Rene Magritte next. So with Rene, what he did is he was mostly well known for his juxtapositioning of unrelated objects in pictures. So we see this in the middle picture with the train and the fireplace, two completely unrelated objects, but are put together in the same scene. Same with the apple. There wouldn't be a ginormous apple filling a room. Two unrelated objects put together to create his paintings. Also, you can tell that he maintained a similar style throughout his career. He used very thin brush strokes and lines to really make his paintings look like they could actually happen. So with the men and the moons above their head, this looks like it could be a real scene, but we know that it's not possible for there to be three moons, and we know it's not possible that they'd be directly above people's heads. Rene Magritte also started his painting career with painting darker mood paintings. So in the upper left-hand corner, this painting is entitled The Lovers. It kind of sets a dark mood with the shadows and the fact that the people have these cloths over their heads. Kind of leads you to wonder what's going on and gives you a mysterious, insecure kind of feeling. Okay, so some common themes or motifs that Magritte used included forests, skies, facades, flames, sleigh bells, wooden planks, his mom's suicide, well-dressed men, and eagles and birds. So with pictures 1 and 3, you can see these well-dressed men. They have a suit, a top hat. He has a few other paintings that I didn't display that also display these mysterious men. And then in 2 and 4, you can see the trees behind the house and then just the plain tree in number 4. And that kind of leads into that forest aspect that he used a lot as well. And then in number 5, you can see on the downward slope of the mountain an eagle head. So he also liked to use birds in some of his work. Also in the lower right-hand corner of that painting, you can see a candle, and that also goes with that flame aspect that he used as well. Same with number 2, there's that light that flame coming from the street lamp. Also with the sky, in every single painting displayed on this slide, there is that sky in the background. So he just kind of used all these things a lot in his paintings, maybe to kind of set a common theme or style amongst them, and maybe these symbols had a special meaning to him, especially his mom's suicide, which we will get into on the next slide. So with Magritte's mom's suicide, we can see in the right upper corner of this slide one of his paintings that he painted of his mom. So some of us might think that this is weird because there is a woman's body as the face. The story goes his mom had committed suicide in the Sabnabra River, and when she was recovered from the river, her nightgown had been swept over her face, so her face was completely covered, and the only thing that was showing was her naked body. So we can see Magritte's depiction of this in this painting, as the woman's face isn't shown. The only way to identify her is from her body, which is now her face. All aboard! Now we're going to talk about Time Transfixed. This is obviously the first painting on our slide here. In this painting, what Magritte tried to do was he tried to capture the feelings that are associated with time standing still. So we can see the clock is frozen, that time isn't moving, nothing in the room itself seems to be moving, maybe besides the train. There's nothing really going on in the room, it's kind of boring. Now for the train that is through the fireplace, again we get that juxtapositioning of objects that Magritte liked to use. The train is completely unrelated to the fireplace. Also, the train is unproportional. So this is the only event in the room on the scale that seems to be unstoppable, is that train. That the train could shatter that boredom, that silence, that time standing still. That train coming through the fireplace is what is breaking this scene and this feeling apart. There was a great quote made by a man named Klingsor about Magritte. He goes on to say that Magritte portrayed his art as a stage on which the natural laws of time and space cease to apply. This definitely relates to this painting, as natural laws of time and space do cease to apply with the train, as this is an impossible event. There wouldn't be a train going through a wall. Trains cannot go through walls and float like this, and the fact that the train is unproportional to what it would be in real life. This painting is very interesting, as Magritte kind of took a spin off of the modern view of a mermaid, where mermaids have a fish tail or lower half and a human upper body. These mermaids have a fish upper body, but then a human lower half. So he's kind of making fun of the beauty that we see in regular mermaids, and these obviously aren't as beautiful as what we depict, so maybe he's questioning, what is beauty? Do we make this beauty? Do we make these roles and ideas that we have set in our head? Again, kind of going against society's views in this way. Now we're going to take a look at Max Ernst, another artist in the Surrealist movement. He had a very active part in the movement. One of his main styles was collaging. Now, not only did he create collage by cutting out magazines, books, or putting random objects together, he also created the illusion of collage by putting texture and shadows and contradictory objects together to make it look like the painting was made with different materials, even though it was all just made with paint. So, some common motifs that Ernst had put in his work included birds, forests, doves, and this creature that he created called a loplop. This creature that he created, he thought of as a doppelganger of himself. This bird-like creature he also called his private phantom. So something that kind of haunts him and that you can see in a lot of his work. And this isn't like a nice dove or a swan. This bird is mean and big, and it has claws and sharp teeth, and you can see on the right painting that they're creepy looking, that they have mean looking eyes, that their beaks are really pointy and they're huge and human like. And then also with the painting towards the middle, we get the same things, the claws, the bird that kind of is charging towards us, lifting its feet. It gives you a sense of kind of terror. With this bird, I think what Ernst did is kind of materialized his fears and his inner demons into this bird and made a reflection of the bad, evil parts of himself. Also, with the common theme of forest in some of his paintings, forest had brought enchantment to him, but at the same time, he had a great terror for forest as a child. So, with a lot of these themes that he has, they're kind of based around this fear and terror that comes out, this kind of nightmare, which is opposite of dreams. Two techniques that are very specific to Ernst are grottage and decalmania. So with grottage, what you do is you scrape color over a canvas which has a textured object underneath it. So this is similar to maybe a little kid taking a template, putting it under a sheet of computer paper, and then scraping crayon so that texture appears on the paper. Ernst did a similar thing with painting and the canvas. So I have an example of that as the first picture. You can see that the bird figures have a different texture, and it also goes along with that collage element that he tried to portray by putting textured objects in his paintings. Now the second technique, decalmania, is where you take a sheet of paper and press it on the paint and then you pull it off. So you can see this with the second painting. The rocks look like they have that paper-y texture to them. This is one of Max Ernst's more well-known paintings called The Elephant of Celebes. There's a giant object in the middle that looks like an elephant, but at the same time, it kind of looks like a machine as well. It has that rounded body, and then the neck or trunk is it reminds me of a vacuum. And Ernst even admitted that he copied it from a corn bin. The name of the monster is also taken from a schoolboy poem that has sexual connotations, which a lot of surrealists put in their work, is this kind of sexual aspect as well. At first, it's hard to understand what this painting is about. So what I thought that was interesting about this painting is that it is actually an underwater scene. We get this idea from the fact that there are two fish in the upper left corner where the blue arrow is pointing. The landscape in which the elephant is standing on doesn't necessarily look like it is underwater, so that feeds into the collage aspect of putting these contradictory elements together. Now, Ernst comments on his painting that elements of such different nature that the absurdity of collecting them confuses the eye and the senses. So this is a confusing looking painting. Like, why is there a tower and a nude woman and this elephant machine thing and fish all together? What point does this have? There isn't really much of a point to this. All of these objects are so unrelated, and with surrealism, like we mentioned in The Emergence, there wasn't really much of a point to things. They tried to get away from society's values and views of logic and reasoning, that things had to have a reason behind them, that everything you did had to be logical. So what Ernst and other surrealists played with was this idea that you can just do things just because. He can put these objects together just because. Just like dreams don't really follow any rules, that anything can happen. Same with these paintings. you can put anything together. So where the purple arrows are pointing at the bullhead and the woman, these things actually kind of do have a relation. If you remember in class when we talked about the Zeus dressing up as a bull to rape a young girl, this is kind of playing off of that. He put these symbols in his painting as well.
The Surrealist movement was a movement that that had stemmed from Dadaism, and with those Dadaist roots, we see this tendency of sometimes the ideas behind the art or the artistic process is more important than the actual art piece itself, which is a trait of Dadaism. The Surrealist movement was very disorganized because of the nature of the break and because of the nature of the participants in the movement. These were artists who took this idea of these social norms, and basically threw them out the window. They were not important anymore. It was actually that a new intellectual tendency could evolve, and artists could develop a perspective enabling them to free themselves from the control of reason. That was the goal of beginning Surrealists, was to not only free themselves from reason, but society as well. It was a desire to break from tradition. Surrealists believe that dreams manifest itself in many materials, in many forms of art, and dreams are a big part of the movement itself. The inspiration from the art, the inspiration obviously for the artist came from an artist's dreams and experiences. It's more personal, and wasn't following any rules. It was whatever came to mind, whatever popped into your head. A common practice would be automatism, just painting, drawing, sculpting, whatever came to mind, whatever happened, and it was used to explore fears, desires, and dreams. It was a way to learn from the subconscious. Not all Surrealists had the same style. There was a wide range of styles that were appropriate that were used in the Surrealist movement, but they were all connected by an artistic and intellectual aspect. One common practice of the time period stylistically there were a couple, and many of them were both developed and used by Max Ernst. For example, there is decalcomania, which is taking some kind of thing and using it to move the paint around, creating a textured feel. For example, some people will use plastic bags when painting their home to give it a textured look, give their walls a textured look. There is grattage, which is taking some kind of tool and scraping dry or semi-dry paint from a canvas. And there is frottage, which is rubbing a pigment on top of a canvas, which is laying on top of a textured surface. This would be comparable to crayon rubbings that we do today.
How did people react to the Surrealist movement? At first, people weren't really sure what to think because everyone was so used to looking at paintings that were more traditional, such as a landscape or building, or just like a nice everyday scene, whereas Surrealist paintings were kind of creepy or bizarre. So a lot of people didn't know what to think and had initially a negative feeling towards Surrealism. Now I want to bring up a man named John Bazin. He was an art critic and young painter in the 1930s. He had written a review about a surrealist exhibit that he had seen. He had attacked the insufficiency of the paintings and the painting style, and saying that basically it wasn't art. He also attacked the fact that the movement didn't really reach its goals. So again, surrealist goals were to kind of get away from that traditional way and change society's views. So he's saying that the surrealist movement hadn't really done anything to change that, and they had failed to meet their goals. John had later admitted that surrealism had been one of the really first movements to kind of separate man from the universe, and he wasn't really against surrealism, and he wasn't an enemy to the people, but he was more disappointed in the fact that surrealism didn't really convert art into this new thing, and they didn't really do much to change society's views. Um, that was just one critic. So there were other critics or critiques that were a little bit nicer. So one man named Bushy Hertz had said surrealism has just as much to say today as it did in its beginnings. The sacred and the profane are united, sense and nonsense bound together, beauty and chaos. This is the truth of life. So what this man liked about surrealism is that it accurately depicted real life, that there's not always just good in the world and there's not always just bad times, that there's both and that they do exist together. Another man named Harris went against what John was saying in that surrealism wasn't characterized by decline, that it did have importance in history, and that it did kind of shape modern art today, and that it did have an impact in later styles of art.
The Face of War was painted by Salvador Dali in 1940. It was painted immediately after the Spanish Civil War and right at the beginning of World War II. It represents Dali's personal view of war, of the wasteful nature of war, and of the death and decay that come along with it. There is a main face that contains many faces, which are really skulls, and each of those skulls contain faces, other skulls inside them. Each face, and even the skulls themselves, have an expression of tortured and tumultuous pain. It is not something that makes you feel good. It is very, very obvious that this is what he is trying to portray with this image. That war is horrific. This piece is called Rope and People by Juan Miró. It incorporated other materials, actual rope, and followed the disfigurement and vague body style of the Surrealists. It had bodies that were only vaguely human. One of Dali's most popular and well-known works is The Persistence of Memory. It features melting clocks and one watch, the only watch that is normal, being devoured by ants. Now, ants are a big motif that Dali had used, and they were used to symbolize death and decay. In this painting, the ones that are swarming on the pocket watch are in the shape of the watch itself, and this even goes farther into symbolizing the death and decay of time. Now, this is supported by the fact that the clocks are melting. It could symbolize time melting away. There is also one other figure in this painting. There is an amorphic figure into the center, to the bottom, and in the foreground. and it melts just like the watches and blends into the black sand. This amorphic figure was said to possibly be Dali's self-portrait. In this, he followed the surrealist way of creating amorphic figures that only vaguely resemble being human, making it ambiguous as to what exactly it is. Because it does look snail-like, it begs the question, just as snails are slow, is this saying that time has slowed down as well? The figure itself looks paralyzed, and it asks the question, is the picture about his unconscious fear of death, or the persistence of memory that paralyzes him? Now, death would be supported by the ants on the clock and the skeletal tree that is holding up one of the clocks, and the persistence of memory would be supported by the figure on the ground that was paralyzed. Now, ultimately, we don't know, because Dali never went into the symbolic meaning of the painting, saying that it was unknown even to himself. Another one of Dali's pieces was Giraffe on Fire. According to Wieland Schmid, the animal appears almost indestructible. In contrast, man would be subject to time, and this can be seen in the face, the hands, and the movements. For example, the figures they look like they are sleepwalking and are also held up by crutches. Now, this can symbolize the difficulty to get forward, to maintain balance. The figures are loaded down by the mysterious contents of the drawers. Crutches can also mean a type of sexual fantasy. The sky and the figures are blue, which can symbolize night. And at nighttime is when we dream and our subconscious is alive. And here we see the dreamlike aspects of surrealism, like what happens when we are asleep, and this painting seems to explore that. It's interesting because as Giraffe is one with the elements, it shows that humans can work against or are in conflict with the elements. Dali was showing beneath the surface there are unsuspected, confusing, and terrifying things. Now, he has also done paintings with bodies with drawers in them before. For example, the Venus de Milo also has drawers and also showed things that were beneath the surface. It symbolizes what lies beneath human psyche that can be made accessible and visible. And he did this with the Venus de Milo, specifically because by manipulating the ancient statue, the epitome of classical beauty, admired and alluded to in European art from the Middle Ages, Dali not only downgrades it to an object, but questions its very nature.
Hey, my name's Jeannie. Apparently we have to introduce ourselves. I also did The Roots of Surrealism and Moreau. Thank you for listening to this presentation thus far, but I have one more thing. I also have the so what portion of this. So, what? Why does surrealism still matter, and where do we see it? Believe it or not, we all probably have used a surrealist technique or have seen it somewhere. For example, many preschoolers or young kids will still use frottage, not to be confused with frotting, please do not look that up, with crayon rubbings when you pick up textures underneath papers with the wax to make pictures. It's all over media as well, like in the anti-smoking campaigns, where the addiction of smoking is personified as, that little guy. In the music video for Do I Want to Know by the Arctic Monkeys, the entire video is very dreamlike and surreal, and I suppose for an easy summary, it's trippy. Considering surrealism was such a big movement in the world, it's no surprise that it has stuck around to today's media.